Shabbat Shalom, everyone. Elie Wiesel wrote, "I marvel at the resilience of the Jewish people. Their best characteristic is their desire to remember. No other people has such an obsession with memory." We see this throughout this week's Torah portion. Multiple times, Moses instructs us not to forget what we saw, not to forget our covenant with God. Moses instructs us to remember our experience as slaves, so we'll remember to observe Shabbat. The Ten Commandments and the first paragraph of the Shema are in this week's Torah portion. Remember Sinai. Teach our children to remember. Talk about the mitzvot, to remember, wearing tefillin, placing mezuzot. It's all about memory. Our tradition stresses the importance of memory for the sake of our relationship with God, our relationship with each other, and for the sake of our relationship with other people. We are commanded to remember that we were strangers in the land of Egypt. This past week on Tisha B'Av, we remembered that we were strangers in most places that we live. We remembered that we have been kicked out of England and France and Spain and Lithuania and Portugal and more. We remembered that we have experienced lies and fear and oppression and pogroms and massacres and worse. And why do we do this on Tisha B'Av? To mourn all that we have lost. And also to remember to care for those without power. Over and over again, we are told to care for the stranger, care for the widow, the orphan, those who are poor. We know what it's like to suffer injustice. And in many different ways, we are instructed to support those who are experiencing injustice. Why? Because we remember. No other people collectively has such an obsession with memory. And yet we also know that memory is a fickle thing, even in the Torah. For we know the story of Moses striking the rock instead of speaking to the rock for water. We know that from the book of Numbers. God informs Moses that because of this, he won't enter into Israel. But here in Deuteronomy, in this week's Torah portion, Moses vents to the people. Now Adonai was angry with me on your account and swore that I should not cross the Jordan and enter the good land. Not quite the same story. Memory is important, but the problem with memory is that we don't always remember it the same, or we don't always prioritize the same memories. Holocaust denial is unfortunately a great example, right? Trying to wash over that sense of history. Look, there's a lot of conversation these days about monuments and statues honoring the Confederacy, most of which were constructed when Black American civil rights were severely hindered in the early 1900s, which certainly colors the significance of these statues. While we know the date, 9/11, we might not recall the significance of May 14th, 1948. Anyone? The founding of the State of Israel. We may not always know the way that Israel's history shapes its current reality. One of our members told me that they were dismayed that many people he spoke with did not know the significance of December 7th, 1941. Anyone?
D-Day.
Right, that's the attack on Pearl Harbor, right? What parts of history do we know? What parts of history are easy to recall, right? When they learned how little they actually knew in recent months, many people have been trying to learn more about the history of racism in the United States. Right? It shows that while the best characteristic of our people may be our desire to remember, it's a challenge when it comes to figuring out what we're supposed to remember. This is a problem for any historian. Even deciding how to tell the story of history. Where do we begin? Do we begin to remember the history of the United States? How? When does it begin? Does it begin with the crossing over of a land bridge? Is that how we begin to tell the history of these United States? Maybe we begin with the first sea-based explorers, or with the Mayflower, or maybe it's with the transatlantic slave trade, or maybe we start in 1776. These are the decisions historians have to make. Just figuring out where to begin to tell the story isn't easy. Now, this is before we get into any bias or ideology. But when you think about it, the writing of history shouldn't be easy, because there will always be decisions that have to be made about what to tell, how to contextualize it. And those decisions are never ending. Such challenges come with humility. It helps to acknowledge that we can never fully know the whole story. There's always more to learn and explore, and there will always be questions, because the record is never as complete as we might wish it to be. So how do we navigate? How do we remember? What do we remember? Our tradition points the way. Jewish tradition wants us to remember so that our actions will confront the realities we face, built upon the wisdom of the past, to connect to God, our people, and all people. And the record of the Jewish people is filled with an honest look at our struggles and our mistakes and our shame, as well as our successes, principled debates, lots of questions, and the understanding that there is so much that we can't answer. Sound messy? Messy is the kind of history that we can trust. If any history only tells about the good things, that's when we need to question. A messy history is the kind of history that can inform our actions today, because then we know that it's at least a little bit more honest. It's a little bit more comprehensive. And that's the kind of history, again, that can inform our actions, because that's the kind of history that's worth remembering. Shabbat Shalom.